Chapter 2. Napoleon's Secret Treaty with Spain. Hoping to reconquer the French West Indies, much of which had been lost in the 1790s through colonist revolts, Napoleon saw New Orleans as a convenient port for supplying the West Indies with food and timber. Napoleon offered the Queen of Spain, Maria Louisa, a kingdom called Etruria in Tuscany, Italy, in exchange for Louisiana. The Queen was excited because she had grown up in Etruria. Her husband, King Carlos IV, was also thrilled because trying to govern Louisiana had been draining the Spanish treasury. This would be a good way to retain the buffer zone protecting the Mexican colony from the United States while having French bear the cost. Flag of Spain, Flag of France. Spain and France formalized the transfer of Louisiana through the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. Secrecy was necessary because if the Americans learned of the deal, they might attack Spain's weak forces in New Orleans. It would be to America's advantage to do that instead of waiting until France, a much more powerful country, controlled New Orleans. In 1801, the newly elected president, Thomas Jefferson, was alarmed to hear that the port of New Orleans might be back in French hands. If this rumor were true, he said, it would be impossible that France and the United States can continue long as friends. On October 15, 1801, he assigned his friend Robert Livingston to be the American minister to France. Livingston's mission was to discourage Napoleon from damaging relations with the United States by acquiring Louisiana. Secret Agent Number 13. James Wilkinson, a friend of Jefferson, had secretly signed on with Spanish officials in New Orleans to become a spy for Spain. He was called Secret Agent Number 13 and had a salary of $2,000 a year. He advised Spain to encourage American settlement of Louisiana in the early 1790s. Secretary of State Jefferson wrote in enthusiasm, "I wish 100,000 of our inhabitants would accept the invitation. It would be the means of delivery to us peaceably what may otherwise cost us a war." James Wilkinson, 1757 to 1825. Livingston tried his best, but the French kept denying that they had a treaty with Spain concerning Louisiana. Meanwhile, Livingston learned that thousands of French troops were on their way to Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, a French colony that had rebelled. A former slave, General Toussaint Louverture, was in charge. Napoleon wanted to retake that island because of its valuable sugar crop. General Toussaint Louverture, 1743 to 1803. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was probably the best educated of early American presidents. He graduated from William and Mary College in Virginia and then studied law. Well-read in science, agriculture, and political history, he was a successful lawyer until drawn into politics as the first Secretary of State under President Washington. He was a skilled architect, designing his own home, Monticello. He died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He wanted to be remembered as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of the University of Virginia, and a fighter for religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson's plantation home, Monticello, is located in Virginia. Today it is pictured on the back of the U.S. nickel. Yellow fever. Yellow fever was a widespread disease in the 18th and 19th centuries. For a long time, people thought the disease was carried by the air. In a way, it was. Yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes. Cities located near marshes or swamps often had yellow fever outbreaks. Thousands of people died from yellow fever. The yellow fever epidemic peaked in New Orleans during the years 1833 and 1853. Livingston asked Napoleon to cede New Orleans to the United States, promising that the port would remain duty-free to French ships. But Napoleon was not interested. Instead, he ordered his naval minister to prepare to take Louisiana by force in case the Americans should resist. But the minister could not form a fleet because most French ships had already sailed for Saint-Domingue. Unknown to Napoleon, large numbers of his troops were being wiped out by Toussaint's force as well as by yellow fever. Jefferson to Livingston. There is on the globe one spot the possessor of which is our natural enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. Robert Livingston, 1787 to 1856. On October 16, 1802, the Spanish governor of Louisiana suddenly banned American traders from storing cargo at New Orleans. This effectively closed the port once more to American ships. Citizens and politicians were outraged and began talking about sending troops to seize New Orleans. Realizing he had to act, in March 1803, Jefferson sent James Monroe to France as envoy extraordinary to help Livingston with his negotiations. James Monroe, 1758 to 1831. The French only controlled New Orleans for 2 years before it was purchased by the United States under the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Monroe was a popular diplomat who had served with George Washington at Valley Forge. Jefferson instructed him to attempt to buy New Orleans in western Florida for $9,375,000. Jefferson and others believed Florida to be under French control, but it actually belonged to Spain. If Monroe's offer was rejected, he was to offer $7.5 million for New Orleans alone. And if Napoleon refused, Monroe was to try to obtain the permanent right of Americans to use the lower Mississippi River and store their wares in New Orleans. How much in today's dollars? Monroe intended to offer $9,375,000, or $151.7 million in today's dollars, for New Orleans and Western Florida, or $7.5 million, or $121.4 million today, for New Orleans alone. France's initial offer for all of Louisiana was $22,500,000, or $364.07 million in today's dollars. The final price? $15 million in 1803, which would amount to $242.7 million if the deal were made today. If Monroe could not achieve any of these goals, Jefferson was prepared to form an alliance with Great Britain and try to take Louisiana by force. The president wrote that the future destinies of this republic depended on Monroe's mission succeeding. A few months before Monroe sailed, Napoleon learned of his disastrous losses in Saint-Domingue. Of 28,300 troops sent in 1802, by September of that year, only 4,000 remained fit for service. With the Constitution of 1802, Toussaint, a leader of the Saint-Domingue Revolution, abolished slavery of the entire island of Saint-Domingue. Also, a new war was looming with Britain, and the French treasury was badly in need of cash. Napoleon's priority was to preserve and expand his European empire. Therefore, during the spring of 1803, he decided to sell all of Louisiana to the United States. In an amazing about-face, he told his advisors, "I already consider the colony as completely lost, and it seems to me that in the hands of the United States, it will be more useful to France than if I should try to keep it." He directed his Minister of Finance, François de Barbé-Marbois, to negotiate with Livingston. Smugly, Napoleon wrote, "This accession of territory strengthens forever the power of the United States, and I have just given to England a maritime rival that sooner or later will humble her pride." François de Barbé-Marbois, 1745 to 1837. Livingston and Monroe negotiating with Barbé-Marbois. France offered the entire territory of Louisiana for $22,500,000. Livingston at first was unprepared, replying that the United States was only interested in New Orleans and Florida. Monroe had just arrived but was confined to bed with painful backaches, so Livingston had to negotiate alone. On April 27th, Livingston and Barbé-Marbois appeared in Monroe's room with the news that Napoleon had lowered his price to $16 million. Monroe and Livingston countered with $12 million, though technically they were operating well beyond their authority. In the final treaty, signed on May 2, 1803, the two ministers agreed to pay $15 million for a chunk of wilderness, the size and extent of which were pretty much undefined. The signed Louisiana Purchase made it to Washington, D.C. on July 4, 1803. Napoleon's words: "Louisiana, its territory, and the dependencies appertaining thereto shall become part of the American Union and shall constitute in due course one or several states according to the terms of the Constitution of the United States. The United States undertake to favor in a special way the commerce and navigation of French citizens. French and Spanish vessels and merchandise shall never be subjected to any of the customs or duties which may be imposed upon the commerce of other nations." Napoleon's order for the sale of Louisiana, April 23, 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. To make sure it reached the United States, couriers carried copies of the treaty on the 3 separate ships. Yet it was nearly 2.5 months before President Jefferson got the news, with the first ship docking on July 14th. When he realized what his envoys had accomplished, an elated Jefferson called the purchase a transaction replete with blessings to unborn millions of men.